Greetings, I'm Salvador Cordova. Welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. In this segment, I'll be raising a topic about atheism based on this title of a book, The Rage Against God, How Atheism Led Me to Faith. This is by Peter Hitchens. Now, if the name sounds familiar, Peter Hitchens is the Christian younger brother of the infamous atheist Christopher Hitchens, who passed away not too long ago. Now, customarily over the last few months, this channel has focused almost exclusively on scientific issues related to the Christian faith. That's partly because that is more of my professional background, and also the target audience has been mostly, though not exclusively, students of science at the college level and graduate level, and also scientists who practice professionally. So that has been the target audience. However, that is not exclusive. I do hope this channel can reach as many people as possible. And not all evidence and reasons for the Christian faith are rooted in science or related to science, and hopefully this segment will show some other aspects, some other reasons to consider the Christian faith. So with that, why don't I just go ahead and just read through a little bit of the Wikipedia article regarding this book, The Rage Against God. In the interest of full disclosure, I've not read the whole book. I don't even own a copy of the book. However, I have watched lectures, which I will link to in the description, that are related to this book, and Peter Hitchens himself giving a description of what is contained in the book. I'm not going to read the entire Wikipedia article. However, I'll highlight some parts that I think were important. I'll then follow by quoting some excellent articles by a blog that echoes similar sentiments. The Rage Against God. Subtitle in the U.S. editions, How Atheism Led Me to Faith, is a book by Peter Hitchens published in 2010. The book describes Hitchens' journey from atheism, far-left politics, and bohemianism to Christianity and conservatism, detailing the influences on him that led to his conversion. The book is partly intended as a response to God is Not Great, a book written by his brother Christopher Hitchens in 2007. Peter Hitchens, with particular reference to events which occurred in the Soviet Union, argues that his brother's verdict on religion is misguided, and that faith in God is both a safeguard against the collapse of civilization into moral chaos and the best antidote to what he views as the dangerous idea of earthly perfection through utopianism. The Rage Against God received a mostly favorable reception in the media. Now, this was in 2010, so things have changed. I'm going to skip some of the background. Part 1, A Personal Journey Through Atheism. In Chapter 1, Hitchens describes abandoning religion in his youth and promoting cruel revolutionary rubbish as a Trotskyist activist. He claims his generation had become intellectually aloof from religion, rebellious and disillusioned, and in Chapter 2 explores further reasons for his disillusion, including the Suez Crisis and the Profumo affair. In Chapter 3, Hitchens recounts he embraced scientific inquiry and adopted liberal positions on issues such as marriage, abortion, homosexuality, and patriotism. Chapter 4 is a lament for the noble austerity of his childhood in Britain. Chapter 5 explores what Hitchens views as the pseudo-religion surrounding Churchill and World War II heroes, a great cult of noble patriotic death, whose only equivalent, he claims, was in the Soviet Union. Hitchens asserts that the Christian church has been powerfully damaged by letting itself be confused with love of country and making of great wars. In Chapter 6, Hitchens recalls being a foreign correspondent in the Soviet Union and a trip to Mogadishu, and how these experiences convinced him that his own civilization was infinitely precious and utterly vulnerable. His own civilization was infinitely precious and utterly vulnerable. I'm going to pause a little bit and just comment. It now makes sense what that phrase means. The civilization, the life that he was living, was infinitely precious. It is something that is very rare in human history, but it's also utterly vulnerable. In Chapter 7, Hitchens charts his return to Christianity and makes particular reference to the experience of seeing the Roger van der Weyden painting The Last Judgment. And I'm going to show that here. That is that painting there. And you could see Christ at the center top, and then all those people about ready to be sent to hell. He saw this painting, and that had an effect on him. So it says here, quote, "I gaped, my mouth actually hanging open. These people did not appear remote or from the ancient past. They were my own generation. I had absolutely no doubt I was among the damned." In Chapter 8, Hitchens examines the diminishing of Christianity in Britain and its potential causes. I'm going to pause and reflect a little bit here, since I did hear his accounts and then some other things that he said and other people said of his book. He actually doesn't detail like a conversion experience. He actually doesn't like that term. I think transformation might be a better, a more fitting word that he might find more agreeable. That I don't think he talks much about spiritual things, and some of his approach to proof is not exactly what you would find in other Christian apologetics that focus on historical evidences, arguments about fine-tuning and intelligent design, although there is some indication that he's sympathetic to these things. But his book specifically, and as far as I could tell, his transformation was not based so much on those things: archaeology, history, cosmology, intelligent design, or even some of the classical philosophical arguments. It seems he didn't really go into depth about his personal experience in becoming a Christian again. That wasn't the point of his book. It wasn't about him, which I respect that. There's been a tradition among certain writers not to talk about themselves too much or their personal experiences, and I respect that. So, as far as I could tell, and also when I heard his discussion of his book, it wouldn't follow what would be seen as traditional Christian apologetics, but it was still very powerful because it related to my own return to Christianity when I nearly left. I just had to pause there, and we'll just continue. In Chapter 8, Hitchens examines the diminishing of Christianity in Britain and its potential causes. Part 2, Addressing Atheism, the 3 failed arguments. In Chapter 9, Hitchens contends that the claim that religion is a source of conflict is a cruel factual misunderstanding, and that the number of conflicts, including the Troubles and the Arab-Israeli conflict, were not motivated by religion, but tribal in nature and disputes over territory. Chapter 10 discusses whether morality can be determined without the concept of God. Hichens asserts that atheists have a fundamental inability to concede that to be effectively absolute, a moral code needs to be beyond human power to alter. He also describes as flawed his brother's assertion in God is not great, that the order to love thy neighbor as thyself is too extreme and too strenuous to be obeyed. Hichens ends the chapter by stating, "In all my experiences in life, I have seldom seen a more powerful argument for the fallen nature of man and his inability to achieve perfection than those countries in which man sets himself up to replace God with the state." I'm going to pause briefly here just to make a little commentary. And this resonated with me. I was hanging out with atheists when I nearly left the Christian faith, and I asked simple questions like, where do you find purpose in life and what is meaning? And this is really tied also to morality. They had no satisfying answers. And that turned me back to the Christian faith. That was reinforced. So that was around the time frame of 2000, 2001, 2002. But that was reinforced in around 2011 when I saw this thing called Elevatorgate, which is worth another show in itself, where we saw atheists having an infighting in their community and making some very vulgar threats of violence, allegedly, toward each other over this thing about it was some argument over dating or something. Someone had asked an atheist activist named Rebecca Watson, invited her for coffee in his hotel room. The whole thing blew up. People were threatening each other. There's just massive hysteria. And what struck me was that they behaved so uncivilly, so irrationally. There's no need to be having a discussion about this and then starting to threaten each other with physical violence. And I'm not going to describe some of the acts that were suggested. This is a family-friendly channel, and so we try to limit the use of certain words. Yes, it was that bad. The behavior was absolutely frightening and disgusting. And you could just see anger, rage, and hatred. And I was just like, where's all this appeal to reason and science? There was none of that. It was just craziness. And we see this on, that was just a small picture of what we have seen play out, like say in the streets of Portland recently with Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And with the Black Lives Matter, black men were being killed for trying to protect the burning of their friend's property. This was just horrible. I said, the utter hypocrisy that was going on, and then just the rampaging and destruction of innocent people's properties and jobs, including the jobs of African American individuals. This was just nuts. So I'll continue on. It's worth quoting again. I have seldom seen, in all my life experience, I've seldom seen a more powerful argument for the fallen nature of man and his inability to achieve perfection than those countries in which man sets himself up to replace God with the state. Hichens begins chapter 11 by asserting, those who reject God's absolute authority, preferring their own, are far more ready to persecute than Christians have been. Those who reject God's absolute authority, preferring their own, are far more ready to persecute than Christians have been. So yes, I think that is a fair assessment that Christians have persecuted, but the ones who've rejected God's absolute authority have been far more ready to persecute. Each revolutionary generation reliably repeats the savagery. He cites as examples the French Revolutionary Terror, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Holodomor, and the Soviet famine of 1932 through 33, the barbarity surrounding Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans, repeated in the Great Leap Forward in China, atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge, and human rights abuses in Cuba under Fidel Castro. Hichens then quotes a number of prominent communist thinkers' pronouncements on morality, including George Lukács, stating, quote, "Communist ethics makes it the highest duty to accept the necessity of acting wickedly. This is the greatest sacrifice the revolution asks from us." I'll repeat it again. Communist ethics makes it the highest duty to accept the necessity of acting wickedly. This is the greatest sacrifice the human revolution asks from us. And Leon Trotsky claiming that morality, more than any other form of ideology, has a class character. Well, I don't know what that means. I'll just move on. Part 3, the League of the Militant Godless. By the way, that I think that was an official term in the Soviet Union. Hitchens writes, "The biggest fake miracle staged in human history was the claim that the Soviet Union was a new civilization of equality, peace, love, truth, science, and progress. Everyone knows that it was a prison, a slum, a return to primitive barbarism, a kingdom of lies where scientists and doctors feared offending the secret police, and that its elite were corrupt and lived in secret luxury." Let me read that again, because hard as it is to believe, there are a lot of people, it seems, especially in academia in the West, that believe in the Soviet Union. I mean, I was shocked to hear it when I was growing up, but so I'll read this again. "The biggest fake miracle staged in human history was the claim that the Soviet Union was a new civilization of equality, peace, love, truth, science, and progress." Forgive me for laughing. "Everyone knows that it was a prison, a slum, a return to primitive barbarism, a kingdom of lies where scientists and doctors feared offending the secret police, and that its elite were corrupt and lived in secret luxury." He then cites Walter Duranty's denying the existence of the Great Ukrainian Famine and Sidney and Beatrice Webb's acceptance that the 1937 Moscow show trials were genuine criminal prosecutions. Hichens then examines Lenin's suppression of religion in the Soviet Union, which included making the teaching of religion to children punishable by death by the death penalty, and the creation of an anti-religious organization of Soviet workers. Hichens begins chapter 13 by quoting William Henry Chamberlain. "In Russia, the world is witnessing the first effort to destroy completely any belief in supernatural interpretation of life." And then examine some consequences of this, including intolerance of religion, terror, and the persecution of priests and bishops at the Solovetsky concentration camp. Hichens asserts that in the Soviet Union, the regime's institutional loathing for the teaching of religion and its desire to eradicate it survived every doctrinal detour and swerve. That last sentence isn't too clear to me. In any case, in the final chapter, Hichens analyzes a number of his brother's arguments and contends that the coincidence in instinct, taste, and thought between my brother and the Bolsheviks and their sympathies is striking and undeniable. He then records how his brother nominated the apostle of revolutionary terror, Leon Trotsky, for an edition of the BBC radio series Great Lives, praised Trotsky for his moral courage, and declared one of Lenin's great achievements was to create a secular Russia. Hichens, that is Peter Hitchens, speculates that his brother remains sympathetic toward Bolshevism and is still hostile towards the things it extirpated, including monarchy, tradition, and faith. He ends the chapter by claiming a form of militant secularism is becoming established in Britain and that the rage against God is loose. The Epilogue. In the Epilogue, Hitchens describes how after a 2008 debate with his brother Christopher that the longest quarrel of my life seemed to be unexpectedly over, and that he held no hope of converting his brother, who had, quote, bricked himself up in his atheist tower with slits instead of windows from which to shoot arrows at the faithful. I highly recommend some of the other writings of Peter Hitchens that you can find regarding his book, and also some of the interviews. I will put some links in the video description. Again, I'm going to point out it is not a traditional Christian apologetics that appeals to archaeology, history, intelligent design of the cosmos and life, or even some of the other traditional philosophical arguments. So one might be a little bit shocked, and what's the proof? What's the evidence for Christianity? Maybe the way to look at this book in particular is, what's the evidence that atheism is true? The other thing is, does it even work as promised? Does it liberate humanity from the tyranny of religion? Look what happens to these societies that where humans are the final arbiter of what is true and noble and what is moral. You could see that in some of the quotes by the communists, and that is extremely disturbing. And he was saying that, in very affluent circles, the people are able to get along with their atheism. But you go from like Richard Dawkins' neighborhood to just a few miles away to the slums, and that lack of morals, were not so much lack of morals, but the moral code that's determined by human beings, you get to see the horrors of how that plays out. And that's how it's played out in these atheist societies. What I mean by atheist societies is societies where belief in Christianity, specifically Christianity, is forbidden. What I don't like is when people conflate religion in general with Christianity. Christianity claims specifically to be the one true religion, and so this wasn't a defense of all religious beliefs. This was a defense of specifically the Christian body of beliefs. And as I pondered this, I said, what the atheists claim that it's going to seem to imply that this may usher some sort of utopia, that we just need to snuff out religion and things will get better. We've had sadly experimental evidence of where this leads. Maybe that is just a small hint then, maybe not an absolute proof by any means of the imagination, that maybe atheism is wrong, that maybe the reason that society seems to prosper when there is an appeal to a lawgiver that judges right and wrong, even though we don't always like some of the things that the lawgiver gives. I mean, we as humans, that is a stabilizing force of humanity. Whether that ultimately proves God, I don't think that's a strong enough proof, but it is a hint that maybe it is true. And the other thing is, if atheists cannot see this for themselves playing out, then I also just collectively, I have to distrust the reasoning. If they don't see that this will not end well, that they keep deluding themselves that it's going to end in utopia, I have to trust their judgment. And Peter Hitchens, in his interview, which I will link to, pointed out that some of the reason atheism right now has not led to absolute decay in certain Western cultures is that it's like the sun setting. There's a point sort of just near twilight when the sun has already set, but there's still enough light that you can read, but the darkness is about to come. Now, with that, I'd like to highlight this blog. It's by my longtime internet friend, who I actually don't know personally. He is known as Mike Jean, and now he goes by Michael. Mike Jean was a ID advocate, very well respected ID advocate who believed, like Michael Behe, in universal common ancestry. He runs this blog, which I'll link to in the description, called Shadow to Light. And I'm going to share some interesting thoughts here. It's a great blog. March 11, 2021. Let me quote from a recent article from The Atlantic that wisely notes, as religious faith has declined, ideological intensity has risen. If secularists hoped that declining religiosity would make for more rational politics, drained of faith's inflaming passions, they are likely disappointed. As Christianity's hold in particular has weakened, ideological intensity and fragmentation have risen. American faith, it turns out, is as fervent as ever. It's just that what was once religious belief has now been channeled into political belief. Political debates over what America is supposed to mean have taken on the character of theological disputations. This is what religion without religion looks like. And the notion that all deeply felt conviction is sublimated religion is not new. Abraham Kuyper, a theologian who served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands at the dawn of the 20th century, when the nation was in the early throes of secularization, argued that all strongly held ideologies were effectively faith-based, that no human being could survive long without some ultimate loyalty. If that loyalty didn't derive from traditional religion, it would find expression through secular commitments such as nationalism, socialism, or liberalism. The political theorist Samuel Goldman calls this the law of the conservation of religion. I like that. The law of the conservation of religion. In any given society, there is a relatively constant and finite supply of religious conviction. What varies is how and where it is expressed. This is gold. If you look at, like it said, commitments to socialism, you'll see it has a very religious character, like in the Soviet Union or elsewhere, even when the empirical evidence is totally against it. There's a secular commitment to it. So the idea is that this is kind of a religion of its own. It is a faith-based body of beliefs that's pretending not to be religious and evidence-based. And as I pointed out, that whole ordeal of Elevatorgate is an example of, is a small mini example of how this plays out. Religion, in part, is about distancing yourself from the temporal world with all its imperfection. At its best, religion confers relief by withholding final judgments until another time, perhaps until eternity. The new secular religions unleash dissatisfaction not toward the possibilities of divine grace or justice, but toward one's fellow citizens who become embodiments of sin, deplorables, or enemies of the state. No wonder newly ascendant American ideologies, having to fill the vacuum where religion once was, are so divisive. They are meant to be divisive. On the left, the woke take religious notions such as original sin, atonement, ritual, and excommunication, and repurpose them for secular ends. Adherents of wokeism see themselves as challenging the long dominant narrative that emphasized the exceptionalism of the nation's founding, whereas religion sees the promised land as being above in God's kingdom. The utopian left sees it as being ahead in the realization of a just society here on earth. And finally, so that was the Atlantic article. And Mike here just has his personal commentary. I don't have time to comment now, but for me, these all point toward the truth of Christianity. Again, echoing, I'll comment here. And I do look forward to reading what Mike has to say, that these point to the truth of Christianity. The Bible is taught about the human inability to achieve their utopia, their own salvation. That is a central theme in Christianity, that we need God's help. We need God's help. We need God's help. Even Christians need God's help. And Peter Hitchens did point out that they said, what would happen if we all became professing believers? He said that won't necessarily create utopia either, because we are still flawed human beings. We still need, I'm adding, this is my thought, we would still need God's help. We cannot we cannot create our own salvation. We need God's help to find salvation, to find heaven and perfection. That we are imperfect and in need of a Savior. That is a very Christian theme. So I could see how Mike is extrapolating this, that every attempt to violate that central truth, that we need help from above, that we are incapable, that we are imperfect, that we can't do it by ourselves. It's played out on so many levels. You know, theologians may talk about this, but when you start to see it playing out, where people are trying to create their own salvation with their own wisdom and ability, and basically them being the final judge of what is right and wrong, it doesn't end well. It doesn't end well. There's no evidence that where humans are the final judge of what is right and wrong, that it will end well. It works better when humans accept the thought that there is a transcendent moral law in the universe that governs, that dictates what is right and wrong. Now, does this ultimately prove Christianity? And as I said, I don't believe so, but it certainly points to it. And so that subtitle by Peter Hitchens, How Atheism Led Me to Faith, yes, I totally get it. Because it's like, okay, I look at the atheist view and where it leads and where it promises, or at least where it promises for many atheists. It doesn't look good. And I began to say, well, you know, my chances of finding any meaning here is zero. And I turned back to Christianity. And I said, what little fragments of evidence I have, I'm going to gather and go with that, and maybe look for some more. And in the process, I became more convinced of the Christian faith. And this had an effect on Mike, just watching what's playing out. He by his own admission, he said he was a little backslidden, but then he started to see the behavior of society. And that was the thing that began, he left creationism, but he still held to Christianity. But observing how the new atheism was taking over Western culture and its effect, it began to point him back toward Jesus Christ. And he seems to be one of the most fervent exponents of Christianity, at least in terms of his writing. He seems more convinced now than I knew him, when he was sort of like kind of meandering a little bit. His words was backslidden, but I've seen the change in his heart as he's considered the news and what people are saying. So I love this blog, and maybe just a little detour. I'm going to highlight one other thing that I found really interesting. So again, I'm going to just say this is a detour. This is not the main talk of the main topic of what I was talking about. But since we're at Michael's blog here, Shadow to Light, I'm going to cover one of his recent posts. Is free speech a Christian value? I was thinking, he writes, I was thinking about the growing number of people who show contempt for free speech as they believe the state needs to silence opposing dangerous opinions. It is an approach that is alien to my way of thinking. Perhaps it is time to consider that the rise of anti-free speech sentiments might be connected to the rise of the post-Christian world. After all, it is clear that not all worldviews value free speech. We know, for example, that two large non-Christian worldviews, Islamic fundamentalism and atheistic communism, disdain free speech and do everything they can to silence unapproved speech which they deem harmful. We also know many countries in the West which at least have a remnant of respect for free speech have been shaped by Christianity in the past. If free speech is indeed a value derived from Christianity, perhaps it is an offshoot of recognizing the importance of free will. We would predict the rise of the post-Christian world would lead the rise of anti-free speech sentiments. While I'm not claiming an established causal connection, I would like to raise this as a hypothetical proposal. So he's raising it as a hypothetical proposal. And in the era of deplatforming, this is going to be interesting. As we all know, much fuss has been made of the fact that the millennials are less religious than older generations. But this is not the only way that millennials differ from previous generations. For example, a few years back, a survey found that over 40% of millennials believe that the government should outlaw speech that is deemed offensive to minorities. Apparently, these young people would not agree with George Orwell's famous quote, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. In fact, here is a breakdown by generation. Millennials, 18 through 34, oppose free speech, 40%. Religion is important to you, 41%. Gen X, oppose free speech, 0.27%. Religion is important to you, 0.53. The Boomers, 0.24 oppose free speech, and 0.59 religion is important to you. And the silent generation, 0.12 oppose free speech, 0.67 religion is important to you. Wow. Don't need statistics or a graph to notice that relationship. But just for fun, let's plot the percentage of people who think religion is important on the y-axis and the percent of those who oppose free speech on the x-axis. Oh my. Do you see the correlation? It's a pretty powerful correlation. Note, now that's a correlation. The less important religion, the more likely someone opposes free speech. What about the percent who have a very strong conviction that God exists? Here are the data. And again, the numbers are similar. And see if Mike plots it out. And those who oppose free speech and belief in God. Pretty strong correlation. So, both increasing secularism and atheism are correlated with decreasing commitment to free speech. Interestingly enough, this trend is also seen in the new atheist's favorite cultural comparison. Europe more supportive than U.S. of censoring statements offensive to minorities. So on the left side, government should be able to prevent people from saying these things. And then on the right, people should be able to say these things publicly. And you can see in the U.S., there's a largest percentage for free speech. Food for thought, eh? Food for thought. So with that little detour, I'm going to maybe go back and summarize and see if I have some thoughts here about the Rage Against God, the book. There were, I'm trying to summarize here. I have to collect my thoughts and maybe page through this a little bit as a summary. Otherwise, I'll just close this segment. Oh yes, now I know what I wanted to say. There was one part that wasn't mentioned here, that was mentioned in other writings about this topic, is that these atheistic governments, they deem it to be a very specific threat to their existence. The idea that God is the lawgiver, because that challenges their authority. See, their authority has no hold if they're accountable to a higher power. But if they are, quote unquote, the God on earth, the final arbiter of what's right and wrong, then, at least in terms of human power, they can retain authority. But the moment people begin to think, oh my goodness, these guys are wicked, they need to be held into account for the way that they live, because they are evil, then their authority is challenged. And so so there is a strong current to destroy Christianity, because Christianity, there is the conscience that it's not right to be doing the sort of things that Stalin and Mao were doing, that it's not right, that it should not be sanctioned. And that's not to say that people are necessarily to take up arms, but they still find that threatening, that people will hold their leaders in contempt, will hold their leaders in contempt as violating a higher law. And so that is the frightening side of atheistic totalitarianism. These people that rise to power will feel very threatened, and that's why they persecute Christians, because the idea that there is a God who they will ultimately be accountable to, they find very unsettling, and they don't want people thinking that. They don't want people thinking that. I mean, because even on a small scale, let's say that, and this played out during the early years of Christendom, the emperor demanded that certain soldiers would do certain things, like burn incense to the emperor, or commit certain atrocities in persecution of Christians. And the soldiers who were Christians wouldn't do it, at the risk of death. I mean, there's a famous story of Marcellus, who was a very brave, courageous Roman soldier, but then he was commanded to do a certain, I guess, ritual rite or something, and he refused to do it because he said he's accountable to God. He was martyred for it. And you get enough people that are willing to die for what they believe, to their belief in God, the government is not going to be able to stand. That's what happened. That was the end of the paganism. That was slowly the turn of the paganism to Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, as people were turning to God. And it's interesting. That's another subject of study. Why did so many people turn to God? There were so many other. Why did they turn to the Christian God? There were so many other religions to adopt. Why did they adopt the Christian faith? I will argue that it was the miracles in the name of Jesus, both in healing and exorcisms. That's why it overtook the Roman Empire. God's power was working in people's lives, that they are willing to turn to Jesus Christ and forsake the other gods. There's so many other things they could have adopted, but why did they commit so fervently to this? Many people in the United States, sadly, especially even in the what I would call the preacher missionary class, tend to view conversion to Christianity in terms of a marketing campaign. And I find that very distasteful. Some of the things that they say sound too much like a marketing campaign rather than an appeal to God's power in people's lives. I mean, it's really sad. I heard something really distasteful by Jerry Falwell Sr., who said, well, America needs to live because they have the money to spread the gospel. I was really offended by that. The gospel is not spread by human power. It is spread by the power and grace of God. And God doesn't need American money to turn hearts toward the Lord. And we see this happening in Iran and in other places where faith in Jesus Christ is growing, and has nothing to do with the marketing, these slick, savvy, well-financed marketing campaigns, which really aren't doing all that well here in the United States, where Christianity is declining anyway. So that's just kind of my little mini rant there. So I hope you've enjoyed this segment. I hope you'll enjoy considering some of the ideas in Peter Hitchens' book, and maybe seeing a little bit of some of his interviews, and also the Shadow to Light blog. So it's been a joy having a chance to share these ideas with you this evening. Take care, and God bless you.